The smell of turpentine and old varnish hung in the air like a quiet secret. Claire Montgomery pressed her magnifying lens closer to the canvas, her fingers steady, her breathing slow. The painting in front of her was beautiful, a 19th-century oil landscape she had picked up at an estate auction 3 weeks ago for a price that felt almost too good. Rolling green hills, a crumbling stone chapel, a sky bruised with gold and violet. Whoever had painted it understood loneliness. That much was obvious. She dragged a cotton swab dipped in solvent across the lower corner, carefully lifting away decades of grime. Restoration was patience. It was listening to what the painting wanted to become again, and Claire was very, very good at listening. Her studio sat on the second floor of a converted brick warehouse in Boston's Seaport district. Tall industrial windows, exposed beams, canvases lined against every wall like silent guests at a party nobody threw. At 31 years old, Claire had built this place from nothing. No investors, no family money, no safety net. Just skill, obsession, and the kind of stubbornness that made her forget to eat dinner most nights. Tonight was one of those nights. Her phone showed 11:47 p.m. A half-eaten granola bar sat on the work table beside a cold cup of coffee she had poured hours ago and never touched. She leaned back, stretched her neck, and was about to call it a night when she heard it. A heavy metallic click echoed from the main entrance downstairs. Then another, and another. 3 locks, all engaging at once. Claire froze. She lived alone, she worked alone, and those locks could only be controlled from the outside panel, a panel she had never given the code to anyone. Her heart kicked against her ribs. She reached for her phone, but before her fingers could dial, she heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, confident. The kind of footsteps that didn't belong to someone sneaking in. They belonged to someone who owned every room they walked into. The staircase groaned under the weight of whoever was climbing it, and then the door to her studio swung open. 2 men stepped in first. Young, sharp-jawed, dressed in dark suits that probably cost more than her rent. They moved to opposite corners of the room without a word, hands folded in front of them, eyes scanning everything and settling on nothing. And then he walked in. Arthur Vance. Claire didn't know his name yet. She didn't know anything about him. But the moment he stepped through that door, she understood one thing with absolute clarity. This man was used to being obeyed. He stood about 6'2", with broad shoulders that filled the doorframe like it had been built around him. His suit was charcoal grey, cut so precisely it looked like armour. His hair was silver at the temples, dark everywhere else, swept back with the kind of effortless discipline that spoke of decades of control. His jaw was square. His eyes were dark brown, almost black, and they carried something heavy behind them, something that had seen the worst of the world and decided to run it instead. He was 60 years old, and he looked like the most dangerous man Claire had ever seen. "Miss Montgomery," he said. His voice was deep, unhurried, like a river that knew exactly where it was going. "I apologize for the dramatic entrance. It seemed more efficient than making an appointment." Claire's throat tightened. "Who are you? How did you get in here?" "My name is Arthur Vance, and getting into places is something I've never found particularly difficult." He glanced around the studio, taking in the canvases, the tools, the scattered brushes. His gaze paused on the painting she'd been working on, the 19th-century landscape sitting under the bright restoration lamp. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of recognition. "That painting," he said quietly. "Where did you acquire it?" "An estate sale in Newport, 3 weeks ago. I have the receipt if you're planning to accuse me of something." Arthur's mouth curved, just barely. "I'm not here to accuse you of anything. I'm here because that painting belongs to my family. Or rather, what's hidden inside it does." Claire blinked. "Hidden inside it?" Arthur walked closer. He moved the way old money moves, without rush, without permission. He stopped beside her work table and looked down at the canvas with the kind of focus she usually reserved for her own restorations. "This canvas has a double lining," he said. "Stitched between the original layer and the backing is a micro-ledger. Coded entries, account numbers, coordinates. It was placed there over 40 years ago by someone who worked for my father." Claire stared at him. "You're telling me there's some kind of secret document sewn inside this painting?" "I'm telling you it's been missing for 23 years, Miss Montgomery, and you bought it for $1,100 at a weekend auction." He looked at her. Funny how the most valuable things end up in the most unlikely hands. Claire's mind raced. She thought about calling the authorities. She thought about screaming. She thought about the fire escape behind the supply closet. But Arthur hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't threatened her. He hadn't even moved aggressively. He was standing 3 feet away, hands in his pockets, watching her the way someone watches a chess opponent they respect. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "Your expertise. That ledger contains encrypted coordinates tied to my family's estate holdings, properties, art collections, and financial records that were scattered and hidden decades ago. I need someone who understands canvas construction, layered restoration techniques, and period-specific materials well enough to extract the ledger without destroying it." He paused. "I'm told you're the best in the city. And if I say no?" Arthur tilted his head slightly. "Then I'll have to take the painting tonight, and the legal trail attached to that estate sale will create complications for your studio. Ownership disputes, licensing reviews, enough paperwork to bury this place for 18 months. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Claire felt them sink. She looked around her studio, at the walls she had painted herself, at the shelves she had built with borrowed tools, at the life she had stitched together one project at a time. 18 months of legal limbo would end her. She didn't have savings for that. She didn't have a backup plan. "There's a private aircraft waiting at the airfield in 20 minutes, Arthur said. "Come with me, authenticate the ledger, help me retrieve what belongs to my family, and when it's done, you walk away clean. Your studio stays yours, your name stays clear." Claire looked at him, really looked at him. Past the suit, past the authority, past the power that radiated off him like heat from a furnace. And somewhere beneath all of it, she saw something she didn't expect. He wasn't enjoying this. He wasn't smiling like a man who had someone cornered. There was something almost careful in his eyes, like he understood the weight of what he was asking and wished there had been another way. She didn't trust him. She had no reason to, but she picked up her coat. "If anything happens to my studio while I'm gone," Claire said, pulling her bag over her shoulder, "I will make your life very difficult, Mr. Vance." Arthur studied her for a long moment. Then, for the first time, he smiled. It was brief, barely there, but it changed his entire face, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds for just a second before disappearing again. "I believe you would," he said. He turned toward the door, and his men moved ahead of him without a signal. Claire took one last look at her studio, at the painting sitting under the lamp, at the quiet life she was about to leave behind. Then she followed him into the dark. The aircraft was nothing like Claire had imagined. She had expected cold leather seats and silence, the kind of sterile, intimidating interior that matched the man who owned it. Instead, the cabin was warm. Soft amber lighting ran along the ceiling in thin strips. The seats were wide, cream-colored, arranged around a polished walnut table that looked like it belonged in a library rather than 30,000 feet above the Atlantic coast. Claire sat on one side of the table, the painting laid flat in front of her on a padded cloth she had brought from the studio. Arthur sat across from her, legs crossed, reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose as he reviewed a stack of documents from a leather folder. His 2 men had disappeared into the forward section of the plane, and for the first time since he had walked into her studio, Claire felt like she could breathe. The engines hummed. The coastline below was invisible, just black water and scattered pinpoints of light from towns she couldn't name. She pulled her tools from her bag, a microscalpel, precision tweezers, a handheld UV lamp, a set of dental picks she had repurposed years ago for delicate canvas work. She arranged them in a neat row beside the painting, the way a surgeon lays out instruments before an operation. "You travel with those everywhere?" Arthur asked, without looking up from his papers. "I travel with these the way you probably travel with those two men in the front cabin," Claire said. "Tools of the trade." Arthur glanced up. The reading glasses softened his face somehow, made him look less like the man who had locked her doors from the outside and more like a university professor who happened to own a private jet. "Fair enough," he said. He set his papers aside and removed the glasses, folding them carefully into his breast pocket. "Can I get you anything? There's coffee, tea. I think there's also something with ginger if you get motion sickness." "Coffee, black." He stood and walked to a built-in counter near the rear of the cabin. Claire watched him pour from a stainless steel carafe, his movements precise, unhurried, the same controlled grace he carried in everything. He set the cup in front of her, and the smell alone woke something up behind her eyes. "Thank you," she said, and meant it more than she expected. She turned her attention back to the painting. Under the UV lamp, the canvas revealed what her naked eye had missed during 3 weeks of surface-level restoration. There it was, a faint rectangular outline along the bottom edge, roughly the size of a playing card. The stitching was extraordinarily fine, almost invisible, blending with the original weave of the linen. Whoever had hidden the ledger inside this painting had known exactly what they were doing. "Your father had this made?" Claire asked, tracing the outline with her fingertip. "My father had a man who handled things like this, a specialist. He understood that physical records were harder to hack than digital ones, and that art was the last place anyone would look for financial documents." "Smart man." "Ruthless man," Arthur corrected quietly. "But yes, smart." Claire picked up the microscalpel and leaned closer. The plane chose that exact moment to shudder, a pocket of turbulence that rattled the coffee cup and sent her hand drifting 1/2 centimeter to the right. She pulled back immediately. 1/2 centimeter on a canvas this old could mean a torn thread, a damaged layer, weeks of irreversible harm. "Steady air my entire life," Arthur muttered, looking toward the window. "Tonight the sky decides to have opinions." Another pocket hit. Claire braced her elbow against the table and tried again, but her hand wavered. The scalpel needed absolute stillness. At this altitude, with this turbulence, she was working against physics. Arthur watched her for a moment. Then, without asking, he reached across the table and placed his hand gently beneath hers. Not gripping, not directing, just offering a stable foundation. His palm was warm and broad, his fingers steady as iron. Claire looked up. Their eyes met across the narrow table, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with the painting, or the ledger, or the reason she was on this plane. It lasted maybe 2 seconds, maybe 3. "Go ahead," he said. "I won't move." She exhaled slowly and lowered the scalpel. With Arthur's hand anchoring hers, the blade moved clean and true along the edge of the hidden seam. Thread by thread, the secondary lining began to separate from the original canvas. Claire could feel it, the subtle give of aged adhesive releasing its grip after decades. 10 minutes passed in focused silence. Then 20. Arthur never shifted. His hand stayed exactly where it was, solid and patient, like a man who had learned long ago that the most powerful thing you could do in any situation was simply hold still. Finally, Claire set the scalpel down and reached for the tweezers. She pinched the corner of something thin, something that crinkled faintly as she pulled it free from the canvas lining. A folded sheet of translucent paper, no bigger than a passport page. Dense rows of tiny handwritten numbers and letters covered both sides, coded, methodical, written in ink that had barely faded. "There it is," Arthur said. His voice had dropped, carrying a weight that told Claire this small piece of paper meant more to him than anything else on the aircraft. She placed it on the cloth under the UV lamp. The numbers shimmered faintly, certain digits written in a phosphorescent ink that only appeared under ultraviolet light. Coordinates, dates, reference codes that meant nothing to Claire but clearly meant everything to Arthur. "Can you read any of it?" she asked. Arthur leaned forward and studied the sheet. His jaw tightened. The first line is a location. Manhattan, Upper East Side. He looked at her. That's where we start. The plane banked gently to the left, and through the oval window, Claire caught the distant glow of a city skyline bleeding orange and white against the dark horizon. New York. Still an hour away, maybe less. She sipped her coffee and studied the man across from her. He had every reason to treat her like a hired hand, a technician dragged along for a job. But he had poured her coffee himself. He had steadied her hand without being asked. And when he spoke about art, about the painting, about the history woven into its threads, his eyes carried a kind of reverence she recognized because she felt the same thing every time she touched a canvas. Arthur Vance was dangerous. Claire had no illusions about that. Men with private jets and security details and hidden ledgers didn't earn those things by being gentle. But dangerous and cruel were two very different words. And so far, Arthur had been nothing close to cruel. "You should rest," Arthur said, pulling his reading glasses back on and returning to his documents. "Tomorrow will be long." Claire leaned back in her seat and looked out the window at the black ocean far below. Rest felt impossible. Her mind was turning too fast, questions stacking on top of questions, each one heavier than the last. But somewhere between the hum of the engines and the warmth of the cabin, her eyes grew heavy. And the last thing she saw before sleep pulled her under was Arthur Vance sitting perfectly still across from her, reading quietly, the faintest trace of that brief smile still lingering at the corner of his mouth. Manhattan looked different from the 63rd floor. Claire stood by the window of the penthouse, watching the city crawl beneath her like a living map. Yellow cabs inching through gridlocked streets, steam rising from subway grates, people moving in every direction, each one carrying a life she would never know about. From up here, the chaos looked almost peaceful. The penthouse itself was ridiculous. 3 floors connected by a floating staircase made of glass and brushed steel. A living room larger than her entire studio. Artwork on every wall, and Claire could tell at a glance that none of it was decorative. A Modigliani drawing near the entrance, a small Cézanne watercolor above the fireplace, a pair of Japanese woodblock prints in the hallway that belonged in a museum, not a private residence. Arthur had given her the guest suite on the 2nd level, a room with a king bed, a marble bathroom, and a closet stocked with clothes in her exact size. That detail unsettled her. He had clearly prepared for her arrival long before showing up at her studio, which meant last night's visit wasn't impulsive, it was calculated. She showered, changed into a simple black sweater and trousers from the closet, and came downstairs to find Arthur in the kitchen. He stood at the counter, sleeves rolled to his elbows, slicing fresh bread beside a spread of cheese, olives, smoked fish, and fruit. No chef, no staff, just him. "You cook?" Claire asked, unable to hide her surprise. "I eat," Arthur said. "Cooking is just the part that comes before. Sit down." She sat at the marble island and watched him plate the food with the same careful precision he brought to everything else. He poured 2 glasses of sparkling water and took the seat beside her, leaving one empty stool between them, close enough to talk, far enough to respect the boundary she hadn't spoken out loud. They ate in comfortable quiet for a few minutes. The bread was warm, the cheese was sharp and perfect. Claire realized she hadn't eaten a real meal since yesterday's lunch, and her body thanked her with every bite. "The coordinates from the ledger," she said, reaching for an olive. "You said Manhattan, Upper East Side. What exactly are we looking for?" Arthur wiped his hands on a linen napkin and pulled the translucent ledger sheet from a slim leather case on the counter. He unfolded it carefully and pointed to the first encoded line. "This references a private storage vault beneath a gallery on East 74th Street. My father used it to hold documents, deeds, titles, authentication records for properties and collections he acquired over 40 years. When he died, access was locked behind a biometric system keyed to his fingerprints. Which you obviously don't have. Which I obviously don't have. But the ledger contains an override sequence, a secondary access code built into the system as a failsafe. Claire, this vault holds the foundational records for my family's entire estate. Properties in 6 states, art worth more than this building, and right now, all of it sits in legal limbo because nobody can prove rightful ownership. Claire studied him. So this whole thing is about inheritance. This whole thing is about legitimacy. Everything my father built exists in a shadow. I want to bring it into the light. She chewed slowly, turning something over in her mind. A question had been sitting in her chest since the plane, growing heavier every hour. She decided to let it out. Why me, Arthur? There are dozens of restoration specialists in the Northeast. Some of them have worked with private collectors for decades. Why break into my studio in the middle of the night and drag me across state lines? Arthur set down his glass. He looked at her directly, and for the first time, the composed mask he wore so effortlessly seemed to thin. Your father was Edward Montgomery. The name landed like a cold hand on the back of her neck. Claire hadn't heard anyone say her father's full name in years. Edward Montgomery, a forensic accountant who had died of a heart attack when Claire was 19. A quiet man who wore reading glasses and fell asleep in his armchair watching baseball. A man she had loved deeply and mourned longer than most people thought was reasonable. What does my father have to do with any of this? She asked, her voice tight. Arthur folded his hands on the counter. 30 years ago, your father was hired by my father's organization to manage a set of offshore accounts. He was brilliant at it, maybe too brilliant. When federal investigators started circling, your father made a decision. He restructured the records in a way that pointed directly at my father and away from himself. My father went to prison for 4 years. Your father walked clean. The kitchen went silent. Claire felt the floor tilt beneath her, just slightly, like the building had shifted on its foundation. You're saying my father framed your father? I'm saying your father survived a situation by making a choice. I'm not here to judge that choice, and I'm certainly not here to punish you for it. Claire's fingers tightened around her water glass. Then why tell me at all? Arthur held her gaze. Because I don't believe in hidden debts between people who share a table. You deserve to know the full picture. And I wanted you to understand something important. I came to your studio last night because I needed your skill, yes. But I also came because I've been aware of you for a long time, Claire. Your work, your reputation. The way you rebuilt your career from scratch after your father's death left you with nothing. He paused. Something shifted behind his dark eyes, something that looked almost vulnerable, though Claire suspected he would never use that word himself. I could have sent someone else to extract the ledger. I could have hired a team and never met you at all. But I wanted to meet you. I've been curious about the woman who turned her father's wreckage into something extraordinary. And now that I've met you, I can tell you honestly, my curiosity was justified. Claire didn't speak for a long moment. The city hummed 63 floors below. The afternoon light moved slowly across the marble counter, turning the water glasses into small prisms. She thought about her father, about the man who had read her bedtime stories and taught her to ride a bicycle and died quietly in a hospital bed on a Tuesday afternoon. The idea that he had been capable of the kind of calculated betrayal Arthur described felt like swallowing broken glass. But she also knew, somewhere deep and honest, that her father had always been careful with the truth. He had always chosen his words like a man selecting which cards to show and which to keep hidden. The vault on East 74th, Claire said finally. When do we go? Arthur watched her for a beat, and she saw something that looked like admiration settle quietly into his expression. Tonight, he said, after dark. The gallery sat on a cobblestone street in Dumbo, tucked between a converted warehouse and a coffee roastery that had closed hours ago. From the outside, it looked like every other high-end art space in Brooklyn: frosted glass doors, minimalist signage, a single spotlight illuminating a sculptural piece in the front window. But Claire noticed the details that didn't belong. The reinforced steel frame behind the glass, the tiny black dome of a motion sensor above the entrance, the faint red blink of a camera mounted beneath the roofline across the street. This place was a fortress dressed up as a gallery. Arthur stood beside her in the shadows of a narrow alley, wearing a dark coat over his suit. He looked completely at ease, like a man waiting for a table at a restaurant, rather than preparing to break into a private collection after midnight. "The vault entrance is on the lower level," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Behind the restoration room at the back. There's a freight elevator that goes down one floor to a climate-controlled storage area. The override code from the ledger should open the secondary panel inside the elevator." "And the security system?" "Infrared grid on the main floor, pressure plates near the display cases, cameras on a rotating loop, 45 seconds per sweep." He glanced at her. "I've had people watching this building for a week." Claire shook her head slowly. "You planned this entire thing before you ever came to my studio." "I planned the retrieval. Meeting you is the part I couldn't plan for." He said it simply, the way someone states the weather, and moved toward the side entrance before Claire could decide what to make of it. The side door had a magnetic lock controlled by a keypad. Arthur punched in a 7-digit code and the lock disengaged with a soft click. Claire raised an eyebrow. "Previous owner owed me a favor," Arthur said. "He never changed the code." They stepped inside. The gallery's main floor opened up around them, wide, white-walled, smelling of polished concrete and cedar. Display cases held small sculptures and ceramic pieces under individual spotlights. Larger canvases hung along the walls, each one lit by a narrow track light overhead. And between every display, invisible to the naked eye, thin infrared beams crisscrossed the floor like a web spun by something patient and precise. Claire pulled a small aerosol can from her jacket pocket, a conservation-grade fog spray she used to detect airflow patterns around delicate canvases. She pressed the nozzle and released a fine mist into the air ahead of them. The beams appeared instantly, glowing red lines cutting through the fog at knee height, waist height, and one at shoulder level that would have been impossible to spot without the spray. Arthur watched her with a look that landed somewhere between impressed and amused. "You brought that from your studio?" "I told you, tools of the trade." She mapped the beam pattern in her head, 3 horizontal lines, evenly spaced, running parallel to the display cases on both sides. The gaps were narrow but consistent, roughly 2 feet between the lowest beam and the floor, and about 18 inches between each line above it. "Stay low and move between the cases," Claire said. "The beams reset every 12 seconds based on the sensor pulse. We move during the gap." Arthur didn't argue. He didn't question her expertise or try to take over. He simply nodded and followed her lead. They moved through the gallery in careful, measured steps, ducking beneath beams, pausing between pulses, navigating the web one section at a time. Claire led and Arthur followed, his large frame folding with surprising agility for a man his size. They reached the back hallway in under 4 minutes. The freight elevator was exactly where Arthur had described it, a steel door with a single call button and a secondary panel hidden behind a maintenance cover. Claire pried the cover off with a flathead tool from her kit, while Arthur kept watch at the corridor entrance. She entered the override sequence from memory. 6 digits, a pause, then 4 more. The panel beeped twice, and the elevator doors slid open. The lower level was cold. Climate-controlled air hit Claire's face the moment they stepped out. Dry, precisely regulated, the kind of environment designed to preserve paper and canvas for centuries. Metal shelving units lined the walls, holding flat storage boxes, rolled documents in protective tubes, and a series of locked steel drawers built into the far wall. Arthur moved directly to the 3rd drawer from the left. He entered another code, and the drawer slid open to reveal a flat wooden case, roughly the size of a chessboard. Inside, cushioned by acid-free tissue paper, was an 18th century sketch, a detailed architectural study of a European estate rendered in brown ink on heavy laid paper. "This is it," Arthur said quietly. He lifted the sketch carefully, examining the margins where faded pencil notations marked dimensions and room labels in French. "My grandfather commissioned this drawing in 1952 from an archivist in Lyon. It maps the original layout of our family's estate in Provence. Claire leaned closer. The draftsmanship was extraordinary, every line confident, every proportion exact. She could feel the history radiating off the paper like warmth from sunlight. Then Arthur's phone buzzed once. He looked at the screen, and his expression changed. The calm drained out of his face, replaced by something sharp and focused. "We have company," he said. "3 men just entered through the front. They tripped the gallery's silent alarm 12 seconds ago." Claire's stomach dropped. "Who are they?" "Rossetti's people, a rival family that's been tracking my movements since I resurfaced the ledger search." He placed the sketch back into its case and closed the lid. "They'll find the elevator in about 90 seconds. He moved fast. He hit the elevator call button and sent the car back to the main floor, empty. Then he pulled Claire toward a service corridor behind the shelving units that led to a utility staircase. The elevator arrives empty, they spend 30 seconds clearing the lower level, and by then we're already street level, Arthur said, guiding her up the narrow concrete stairs with one hand on her back. "And if they follow us up?" Arthur reached the top of the staircase and pushed open a steel fire door. Cold night air flooded in. Parked directly outside, engine running, was a black sedan with tinted windows. One of Arthur's men stood beside the rear door, already holding it open. "They won't catch us," Arthur said. "I've been outrunning people like Rossetti since before you were born." Claire climbed into the sedan, the wooden case pressed against her chest. Arthur slid in beside her, and the door closed. The car pulled away from the curb smoothly, merging into the late-night Brooklyn traffic like it had never been there at all. Through the rear window, Claire saw 3 figures emerge from the gallery's side entrance, looking left and right at an empty street. Arthur straightened his coat and leaned back against the seat. "Philadelphia next," he said. "But first, we drive." They drove through the night. Arthur had decided against flying within minutes of leaving Brooklyn. His man behind the wheel, a quiet, thick-necked driver named Paul, confirmed that Rossetti's people had flagged Arthur's tail number at every private airfield between New York and Washington. Tracking private jets was easy when you knew whose name was on the registration. Tracking a black sedan on Interstate 95 at 2 in the morning was a different problem entirely. Claire sat in the back seat with the wooden case on her lap, watching New Jersey dissolve into Pennsylvania through the tinted windows. Arthur sat beside her, his coat folded neatly between them, his eyes closed but his posture straight. She couldn't tell if he was sleeping or simply thinking with his eyes shut. Either way, he hadn't spoken in almost an hour, and Claire found herself grateful for the silence. Her mind needed room to move. Everything Arthur had told her about her father was still turning inside her head like a stone in a tumbler, wearing down the edges of the man she thought she knew. Edward Montgomery. The quiet accountant who drank black coffee, kept a tidy desk, and never once raised his voice in their home. The idea that this same man had sat across a table from dangerous people, manipulated financial records, and redirected blame onto someone else to save himself, it felt like discovering a hidden room in a house she had lived in her entire life. And yet, small memories kept surfacing. The way her father would go quiet for days at a time, staring at nothing. The locked filing cabinet in his home office that Claire was never allowed to touch. The phone calls he took in the garage with the door closed. She had always explained those things away as adult concerns, grown-up stress, the boring machinery of a life she was too young to understand. Now, she wondered if she had been looking at the truth her whole life and choosing to see something easier. The highway was empty. Pennsylvania farmland stretched flat and dark on both sides, broken occasionally by the yellow glow of a gas station or the red taillights of a long-haul truck. Paul drove exactly at the speed limit, steady and invisible. Around 4 in the morning, Arthur opened his eyes and told Paul to take the next exit. They pulled off the highway and followed a 2-lane road through a stretch of forest until they reached a small, elegant lodge set back from the road behind a stone wall and a pair of iron gates. The sign read Whitfield House, a name that meant nothing to Claire, but clearly meant something to Arthur, because the gates opened before Paul even stopped the car. The lodge was old and beautiful. Stone walls, dark timber beams, a wide front porch with rocking chairs that looked like they had been sitting there since the building was raised. Inside, a fireplace tall enough to stand in dominated the main room, and someone had already lit it. The air smelled like cedar smoke and old books. Arthur spoke briefly to a woman at the front desk, an older woman with grey hair and calm eyes who seemed entirely unsurprised to see a 60-year-old man in a tailored suit walk through her door at 4 in the morning with a younger woman carrying a wooden case. She handed Arthur 2 room keys without a single question. "Get some sleep," Arthur said, offering Claire one of the keys. "We'll leave for Philadelphia around noon." Claire took the key, but didn't move toward the stairs. Instead, she walked to the fireplace and sat down in one of the leather armchairs arranged in front of it. The fire crackled and popped, throwing orange light across the stone floor. Arthur watched her for a moment, then sat in the chair beside her. They stayed like that for a while, staring at the fire, letting the warmth push the cold out of their bones. Outside, the first birds were beginning to test their voices in the trees, and the windows had started to lighten from black to deep blue. "You're thinking about your father," Arthur said. "I'm thinking about what's real," Claire replied. "I spent 12 years believing I knew exactly who he was. Now I'm sitting in a lodge in the middle of Pennsylvania at 4 in the morning with a man who just told me my father destroyed someone's life to protect his own. So yes, I'm thinking." Arthur leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. The firelight caught the silver at his temples and traced deep lines along his jaw. He looked tired for the first time since she'd met him, genuinely tired, in a way that went deeper than sleep. "Your father made a choice under pressure. I've made 100 choices like it, some of them worse." He paused. "The difference between people isn't whether they've done difficult things, it's what they build afterward. Your father built a quiet life. He raised a daughter who turned out to be remarkable. That counts for something." Claire felt a knot loosen somewhere behind her ribs. She didn't agree with him completely. She wasn't ready to forgive something she hadn't finished understanding yet. But his words landed in a place that needed them, and she let them stay. "You're surprisingly philosophical for a man who locked me in my own studio 12 hours ago," she said. Arthur's mouth twitched. 12 hours is a long time. People evolve. She laughed. It was quiet and brief, but it was real. The first genuine laugh she'd let out since this entire thing had started. Arthur seemed to notice. His eyes warmed, and he leaned back in his chair with something that looked like satisfaction. "Claire," he said, and the way he said her name, without urgency, without ownership, just her name spoken carefully like something worth holding, made her look at him. "When this is over, your life goes back to exactly what it was before I walked through your door. Your studio, your work, your freedom. I give you my word on that." He held her gaze, and then added, almost as an afterthought, "Though I'll admit I hope you won't rush back." The fire settled, sending a cascade of sparks up the chimney. Claire pulled her legs up beneath her in the chair and rested her head against the worn leather. She should sleep. She knew that. Philadelphia was coming, and whatever waited there would demand everything she had. But right now, in this quiet lodge with the fire burning low and the sky turning pale outside the windows, she felt something she hadn't expected to feel on this journey. Safe. She closed her eyes. Arthur stayed in his chair beside her, watching the fire die down to embers, keeping guard over a silence that neither of them wanted to break. Philadelphia greeted them with rain. It came down in steady grey sheets as Paul navigated the sedan through narrow streets lined with brick row houses and old factories that had been converted into loft apartments and co-working spaces. The city felt heavier than New York, older somehow, more rooted, like it remembered things the rest of the country had already forgotten. Arthur directed Paul to an industrial block near the waterfront, where a row of corrugated metal buildings sat behind chain-link fencing topped with razor wire. The kind of neighborhood where people minded their own business, because minding someone else's could cost you something. They stopped in front of a building with no signage, just a steel rolling door and a keypad mounted on a concrete post. Arthur punched in a code from the window, and the door rattled upward to reveal a space that made Claire stop breathing for a second. It was a workshop, but calling it that felt like calling the Sistine Chapel a room with some paintings. The interior was enormous. High ceilings, polished concrete floors, and rows of custom-built workstations equipped with tools Claire had only ever seen in catalogues. Industrial scanners, spectral analysis equipment, a vacuum table for document preservation that must have cost 6 figures. Along the far wall, a bank of monitors displayed rotating security feeds from cameras mounted around the exterior of the building. "This is yours?" Claire asked as she stepped out of the car. "This belongs to a man named Declan Harris. Old friend. He restores vintage automobiles for collectors who don't like asking questions." I called ahead. The man himself appeared from behind a lifted Jaguar chassis, mid-50s, barrel-chested, wearing oil-stained coveralls and a grin that suggested he found the entire world mildly entertaining. He shook Arthur's hand with both of his, slapped him on the shoulder, and looked at Claire with open curiosity. "So this is the one," Declan said. "Arthur told me you could take apart a Vermeer blindfolded." "He's exaggerating," Claire said. "He never exaggerates," Declan replied. "That's what makes him terrifying." He winked at her and led them to a workstation near the back, where the lighting was brightest and the air filtration system hummed like a sleeping animal. Claire set the wooden case on the table and opened her bag. She had work to do. The ledger sheet they'd extracted on the plane contained 3 distinct sections of encoded data. The first had led them to Brooklyn. Now she needed to crack the second layer, a denser block of numbers arranged in a grid pattern that she suspected was a substitution cipher tied to a physical key. Arthur spread the ledger flat under a magnification lamp, while Claire examined the paper's composition. The ink had 2 distinct chemical signatures, visible under UV. One for the readable text, and one for a secondary layer that only appeared when heated to a specific temperature. She asked Declan for a precision heat gun, and he produced one from a drawer like a man pulling a rabbit from a hat. Claire worked for 3 hours straight. Arthur stayed nearby, reviewing the decoded Brooklyn documents alongside the emerging Philadelphia data. They spoke in fragments, short questions, brief answers, the efficient language of 2 people solving a puzzle from different ends. By early afternoon, the second layer revealed itself completely. A series of real estate deed numbers tied to properties in Chicago, safe deposit references, and a name, Hargrove Trust, that made Arthur go very still. "What is it?" Claire asked. "The Hargrove Trust is the legal entity my father created to hold the family's legitimate assets. Real estate, art, investment accounts, everything clean. When he went to prison, the trust was frozen by the courts. These deed numbers are the proof of ownership that would unlock the entire thing. And they're in Chicago, in a private estate safe on the north side, which means we need to keep moving." Claire was about to respond when Declan walked over from the security monitors with a look that had lost all its humor. "Arthur, you need to see this." They followed him to the monitor bank. On the second screen from the left, a grainy feed showed the street outside the building's east wall. A dark SUV had parked across the road, engine running, windows down despite the rain. 2 men sat in the front seats, one of them holding something close to his face, binoculars or a camera with a telephoto lens. Arthur studied the screen for a long moment. His jaw tightened, but his breathing stayed even. "That's not Rossetti," he said. "No," Declan agreed. "Rossetti drives German. That's a Cadillac Escalade, custom plates." Arthur straightened. Marcus Webb. The name meant nothing to Claire, but it clearly meant something significant to both men. Declan crossed his arms and let out a slow breath through his nose. "Who is Marcus Webb?" Claire asked. "One of my captains," Arthur said. "Young, ambitious. He's been pushing for a larger share of the organization's operations for the past 2 years. I've kept him on a short leash because he's smart enough to be useful and reckless enough to be dangerous. And now he's parked outside watching us. Now he's making a statement. He wants me to know he's tracking my movements, which means he's monitoring our communications too." Arthur pulled out his phone, removed the SIM card, and snapped it between his fingers. He dropped the pieces into a waste bin beside the monitor station and turned to Declan. I need 3 vehicles, different makes, different colors, staggered departure from 3 separate exits. Declan grinned. The humor was back, though it had an edge to it now. I was hoping you'd say something fun. Within 40 minutes, Declan had arranged exactly what Arthur asked for. A white panel van pulled out of the building's north exit and turned east toward the highway. A silver pickup truck left from the loading dock on the south side and headed west. And a dark blue sedan, different make, different plates, borrowed from a friend of Declan's who asked 0 questions, rolled quietly out of an underground garage entrance that wasn't visible from the street. Claire and Arthur were in the blue sedan. Paul was driving the white van as a decoy. One of Declan's men had the pickup. Through the garage exit camera, Claire watched the Escalade sit motionless for almost a full minute after the van appeared. Then it pulled away from the curb and followed the van east. Arthur settled into the passenger seat and fastened his seatbelt. "Lake Geneva," he said to the driver. "Take the long way." Claire looked at him from the back seat. "You've done this before." "More times than I'd like to remember," Arthur said. He caught her eye in the rearview mirror and held it. "But the company has never been this good." She shook her head, but she was smiling. The blue sedan merged onto the highway, heading west, invisible in the afternoon traffic, leaving Philadelphia and Marcus Webb's surveillance team behind like a thought that had already been forgotten. They arrived at Lake Geneva just before sunset. The drive from Philadelphia had taken 11 hours, most of it on back roads that wound through small towns Claire had never heard of, places with grain silos and church steeples and gas stations that still had hand-painted signs. Arthur had slept for portions of the drive, his head tilted slightly toward the window, his breathing deep and measured. Claire had stayed awake the entire time, watching the landscape change from industrial East Coast to something greener, softer, wider. The estate sat at the end of a private road that curved through dense oak and maple forest before opening onto a clearing above the lake. A stone wall ran the perimeter, low enough to feel welcoming and tall enough to mean business. The gate was wrought iron, old but well maintained, and it swung open as the sedan approached without anyone pressing a button. The house itself was something out of a different century. 2 stories of grey fieldstone and dark timber, with a wide covered porch that wrapped around 3 sides and looked out over the water. Ivy climbed one wall. A pair of Adirondack chairs sat near the shore, facing west, positioned exactly where the last light of the day would fall. Arthur stepped out of the car and stood for a moment, hands in his pockets, looking at the house the way someone looks at a photograph they haven't seen in years. Claire realized this place meant something to him that went beyond property value or strategic positioning. This was personal. "My mother bought this house in 1978, Arthur said, as if answering a question she hadn't asked. She wanted somewhere that had nothing to do with the family business, somewhere she could hear herself think. He walked toward the porch steps. She died here, peacefully in her sleep 15 years ago. I've kept it exactly the way she left it. Claire followed him inside. The interior matched the exterior, warm, lived in, honest. Hardwood floors with wool rugs, a stone fireplace with a thick oak mantel, bookshelves lining an entire wall of the living room filled with old hardcovers and paperbacks whose spines had been cracked open dozens of times. A kitchen with copper pots hanging from a ceiling rack and a window above the sink that framed the lake like a painting. There was no security team here, no monitors, no reinforced doors. The driver parked the sedan in a gravel lot beside the house and disappeared into a cottage at the edge of the property. For the first time since Boston, Claire and Arthur were alone. Arthur built a fire while Claire explored the bookshelves. She found first editions of Hemingway and Steinbeck beside dog-eared copies of mystery novels and a stack of Italian cookbooks held together with a rubber band. His mother's collection, she guessed. The books of a woman who read widely and judged nothing. "There's a kitchen full of provisions," Arthur called from the fireplace. "Declan's people stocked it yesterday. I'm going to cook. Any objections?" "None whatsoever." He cooked a simple meal, pasta with garlic, olive oil, cherry tomatoes, and fresh basil. He moved around the kitchen with the easy rhythm of someone who had done this thousands of times, and Claire sat on a stool at the counter watching him the way she watched a skilled craftsman at work. Every motion had purpose. Nothing was wasted. They ate at a small table by the window as the last daylight faded over the lake. The water turned from gold to copper to deep blue, and the trees along the far shore became dark silhouettes against a purple sky. Candles flickered between their plates, two simple white candles in ceramic holders that looked handmade. "Can I ask you something personal?" Claire said, setting down her fork. "You can ask. I'll decide whether to answer." "Have you always been alone?" Arthur poured more water into her glass before refilling his own. "I was married once, a long time ago. She was a good woman who deserved a man who came home at the same time every night and worried about normal things, mortgage payments, school districts, whether the lawn needed mowing. I couldn't be that man. She left after 6 years, and she was right to. Any children? No, that was one mercy. I've never had much of that to offer." He looked at her across the candlelight. "What about you?" "I came close once. A sculptor I met during graduate school. We were together for 3 years. He was talented and kind and absolutely certain that I worked too much. He was probably right about that. But I couldn't slow down. My studio was everything I had after my father died, and I wasn't willing to let anyone become more important than the thing that kept me standing." Arthur nodded slowly. "So we're both people who chose the work over the life." "Looks that way." He was quiet for a moment, turning his water glass on the table. The candle flame bent sideways in a draft from the window, then straightened. "I've been at the top of something most people can't even imagine for over 20 years, Arthur said. "I've had power, money, influence, fear. Every room I walk into rearranges itself around me, and I can tell you with complete certainty that none of it has ever once made me look forward to tomorrow." He lifted his eyes to hers. "You're the first person in a very long time who's made me think about what comes after all of this." Claire felt the weight of his words settle over her like something warm and heavy. She wanted to deflect, to make a joke, to retreat behind the safe wall of professionalism she had built between them. But something about this place, the quiet lake, the candlelight, his mother's books on the shelves, made that wall feel unnecessary. "I don't feel like a captive anymore," she said. "I want you to know that. Whatever this started as, it's changed." "For me too," Arthur said. They cleared the table together, washing dishes side by side at the sink with the window open and the cool lake air drifting in. Their hands brushed once, reaching for the same plate, and neither of them pulled away quickly. Afterward, they walked down to the water's edge and stood in the darkness, listening to the lake lap against the shore. The sky was enormous here, wider than anything Claire had seen from a Manhattan penthouse or a Brooklyn street. Stars filled it from edge to edge, thick and bright and ancient. "Tomorrow we go to Chicago," Arthur said. "I know. It will be the hardest part." "I know that too." He looks down at her. In the starlight, his face was all angles and shadows, and Claire thought he looked like something carved from the same stone as the house behind them, solid, weathered, built to endure. "Thank you," he said, "for staying." Claire looked out at the dark water. "Thank you for giving me a reason to." They stood there a while longer, two people on the edge of something neither of them had planned for, letting the silence hold everything that words weren't ready to carry yet. Chicago hit different than the other cities. New York had been vertical, everything stacked on top of everything else, pressing upward like it was trying to escape the ground. Philadelphia had been dense and weathered, but Chicago spread itself out with a kind of muscular confidence, all wide boulevards and massive stone buildings that looked like they had been designed by people who expected them to last forever. Arthur and Claire arrived in the Loop District late in the afternoon, driving in from Lake Geneva through suburban sprawl that gradually tightened into the steel and glass grid of downtown. The driver dropped them at the service entrance of a hotel on Michigan Avenue, a grand limestone building with brass revolving doors and doormen in long coats. Arthur had a suite reserved under a name Claire didn't recognize, and the staff greeted him with the careful warmth of people who understood that some guests preferred invisibility over attention. The suite was on the 19th floor. 2 bedrooms, a sitting room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Millennium Park, and a bathroom with a marble tub that could have held 3 people comfortably. Hanging in each bedroom closet was a garment bag with a handwritten tag. Claire unzipped hers and found a dress. Deep midnight blue, floor-length, with a structured bodice and a subtle shimmer woven into the fabric that caught the light when it moved. Beside it, a pair of silver heels and a small velvet box containing a pair of diamond earrings. She walked into the sitting room holding the dress on its hanger. Arthur was standing by the window, already dressed in a black tuxedo that fit him like it had been cut that morning. The white shirt beneath was crisp and open at the collar, and his silver cufflinks caught a piece of the afternoon sun. He looked like a man who had been attending events like this his entire life, because he had. "There's a charity art auction tonight at the Kensington Club," Arthur said, adjusting his cuff. "Private membership, old money, the kind of room where people spend $200,000 on a painting and call it a Tuesday." "And the vault?" 2 levels below the auction hall. The Kensington was built in 1923 as a private bank. When it was converted into a social club in the 70s, the original vault infrastructure was preserved. My father leased 3 deposit boxes there under the Hargrove Trust. The estate deeds are inside. Claire held up the dress. "So we're going to a party?" "We're going to a party. You keep the room occupied. I go downstairs." "How do you plan to access the vault during a live event with a building full of people?" Arthur reached into his jacket pocket and produced 2 keycards, slim, matte black, unmarked. These were cloned from the club's security master set 6 months ago. One opens the service elevator behind the kitchen. The other opens the vault anteroom. I go down during the auction's centerpiece lot when every eye in the room is on the stage. 15 minutes, in and out. "And what exactly am I supposed to do for 15 minutes in a room full of strangers at a party I wasn't invited to?" Arthur looked at her. "Claire, you know more about art than anyone who will be in that room tonight. Walk in there and be yourself. That will be more than enough." She wanted to argue, but the truth was he was right. Art was the one arena where Claire had never needed to fake confidence. She understood paintings the way some people understood music, instinctively, completely, with a fluency that didn't require translation. She went to her room and got dressed. The woman who looked back at her from the mirror 40 minutes later was someone Claire almost didn't recognize. The dress fit perfectly, skimming her frame in a way that was elegant without trying too hard. The earrings caught the light every time she turned her head. She had pinned her hair up loosely, letting a few strands fall around her face, and applied just enough makeup to sharpen her features without masking them. When she walked into the sitting room, Arthur turned from the window. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, open, unguarded, like someone watching the sun come up over water. "You look extraordinary," he said. And the way he said it, quiet, almost reverent, made Claire believe he meant it more than he had meant anything in a long time. They arrived at the Kensington Club at 8 o'clock. The building was a Beaux-Arts masterpiece, all carved limestone and arched windows glowing warm from the inside. A red carpet ran from the curb to the entrance, flanked by security personnel in dark suits, who checked invitations with the kind of polite scrutiny that made it clear uninvited guests simply did not happen here. Arthur presented a black envelope embossed with gold lettering. The guard nodded them through without hesitation. The auction hall was breathtaking. A double-height room with coffered ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and walls lined with museum-quality paintings illuminated by soft track lighting. Round tables filled the floor, dressed in white linen and silver candlesticks. A string quartet played something restrained and beautiful in the corner. 300 guests circulated through the space in tuxedos and gowns, holding champagne glasses and speaking in the measured tones of people who had never once worried about money. Claire and Arthur separated within 10 minutes of entering the room. Arthur drifted toward the service corridor near the kitchen, moving with the casual ease of a man looking for the restroom. Claire walked toward the auction preview wall, where the evening's lots were displayed for inspection. A curator in a charcoal suit approached her almost immediately. "Lovely collection tonight, isn't it? The Renoir sketch is the star, obviously, but personally I think the Sargent watercolor is undervalued." Claire studied the watercolor and shook her head gently. "The provenance is thin. There's a 20-year gap between 1928 and 1948 that the catalogue doesn't explain. Any serious collector would notice that." The curator's eyebrows lifted. 3 more guests turned toward the conversation. Within 5 minutes, Claire had drawn a small crowd: art professionals, collectors, a gallery owner from London who recognized her name from a restoration journal she had published in 2 years ago. She spoke about technique, about material history, about the invisible stories trapped inside layers of paint and varnish. People listened. People leaned in. Claire held the room the same way Arthur held a room, with the simple authority of someone who understood their subject deeply enough to make it fascinating. 15 minutes passed, then 20. Claire kept talking, kept drawing attention, kept being exactly what Arthur had asked her to be: herself. Arthur reappeared beside her just as the auctioneer called the centerpiece lot to the stage. He placed his hand lightly on the small of her back and leaned close to her ear. "Done," he whispered. "We have everything." Claire smiled at the curator, excused herself gracefully, and walked out of the Kensington Club on Arthur's arm, the estate deeds secured inside his jacket, the room behind them none the wiser. The penthouse suite felt different when they returned. Claire noticed it before Arthur did. The sitting room lights were on, all of them, and she was certain they had left only the hallway lamp burning when they departed for the auction. A half-empty glass of whiskey sat on the coffee table, condensation still running down its sides. Someone had been here. Someone was still here. Arthur saw the glass, and his hand found Claire's arm, gently pulling her behind him. His body shifted, shoulders squaring, weight dropping slightly into his legs, the posture of a man whose instincts had been sharpened by 40 years of knowing when a room had been compromised. "Stay close to me," he said, his voice barely a murmur. They moved through the sitting room toward the bedroom corridor. Empty. The kitchen. Empty. Then Arthur's eyes went to the terrace doors. They were open. The sheer curtains billowed inward on the night breeze, and beyond them, against the illuminated skyline of downtown Chicago, a figure stood at the railing with his back to the room. Arthur stepped through the doors first. Claire followed 2 paces behind, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. The man at the railing turned around. He was young, early 30s maybe, tall and lean, with sharp cheekbones and close-cropped hair. He wore a fitted navy suit with no tie, and his hands were empty, resting casually on the railing behind him, as if he had come up here to enjoy the view. But his eyes told a different story. They were restless, calculating, burning with the kind of ambition that doesn't know how to sit still. "Marcus," Arthur said. Marcus Webb smiled. It was a thin smile, the kind that doesn't reach anywhere near the eyes. "Good evening, Arthur. Nice party. I hear the Renoir sketch went for 310,000. You should have bid." "How did you find us?" "You switched cars in Philadelphia. That was clever. But you used Declan's network, and Declan's people talk when you offer them the right number." Marcus pushed off the railing and took 2 steps forward. "You're getting predictable in your old age." Arthur said nothing. He stood perfectly still, his hands at his sides, watching Marcus the way a chess player watches an opponent who has just moved a piece into a vulnerable position. Claire could see the calculation running behind Arthur's dark eyes, assessing distance, angle, options, all of it processed in the time it took Marcus to finish his sentence. "I know you went to the Kensington Vault," Marcus continued. "I know you pulled the Hargrove Trust deeds, and I know what you're planning to do with them. Legitimize the assets, clean the books, restructure everything under a legal framework that cuts the rest of us out." The rest of you were never in, Arthur said calmly. Those assets belong to my family. They always have. Marcus laughed. It was short and sharp, like a bark. Your family. Right. The family that built its fortune on the same operations I've been running for you for the past 8 years. The same operations that paid for this suite, that jet, that estate in Wisconsin. And now you want to wash your hands and walk away clean. Retire to the countryside with your little art restorer and pretend none of it ever happened. His eyes flicked to Claire. She held his gaze and didn't flinch. This isn't about her, Arthur said, and there was something in his voice now, a low current of warning that hadn't been there before. This is between you and me, Marcus. Say what you came to say. Marcus straightened. The casual posture dropped away, and what remained underneath was harder, hungrier. I want the deeds. I want controlling authority over the trust, and I want your seat at the table, permanently. You step aside tonight, sign the transfer documents, and you walk away with your health and your girlfriend and whatever scraps you want to keep. That's a generous offer from someone in my position. Your position, Arthur repeated. And what position is that? The position of the man who tracked you across 4 states, compromised your communications, turned your own people against you, and walked into your hotel suite while you were drinking champagne at a charity auction. Marcus spread his hands. I'd say that's a strong position. Arthur took 1 step forward. Just one. But something about the way he moved, the absolute economy of it, the way the air in the terrace seemed to tighten around him, made Marcus take a half-step backward before he could stop himself. You broke into my suite, Arthur said. You drank my whiskey. You followed me across the country using contacts you bribed and channels you compromised. And now you're standing on my terrace, telling me you want everything my father built. He paused. You forgot one thing, Marcus. What's that? You're alone. Marcus blinked. For the first time, something flickered across his face that looked like doubt. He glanced toward the terrace doors, expecting to see his own backup, and saw nothing. The suite behind the billowing curtains was empty. Your 2 men in the lobby were escorted out by hotel security 12 minutes ago, Arthur said. Your driver received a phone call 9 minutes ago, informing him that his employment with my organization has been terminated. And the man you stationed at the service elevator left voluntarily when he realized the person standing next to him in the corridor was Paul. Marcus's jaw tightened. His right hand drifted toward his waistband, but Arthur closed the distance between them in 2 swift strides, faster than a 60-year-old man had any right to move. His left hand caught Marcus's wrist and twisted it outward, forcing the arm away from the body. His right hand gripped Marcus's shoulder and applied downward pressure with a precision that dropped the younger man to 1 knee on the terrace floor. The entire sequence took less than 3 seconds. Arthur hadn't thrown a punch. He hadn't raised his voice. He had simply redirected Marcus's own momentum against him with the calm efficiency of someone who had been doing this longer than Marcus had been alive. Here's what's going to happen, Arthur said, still holding Marcus's wrist in that locked position. You're going to leave Chicago tonight. You're going to return every document you copied, every contact list you bought, and every piece of intelligence you gathered during your little campaign. And tomorrow morning, you're going to present yourself to the committee in New York, where they will decide what role, if any, you still have in this organization. Marcus looked up at him. His face was tight with pain and humiliation, but underneath it, Claire could see something else. Recognition. The recognition of a man who had bet everything on a hand he thought was unbeatable and just watched the cards turn against him. And if I refuse? Marcus said through his teeth. Arthur leaned down, bringing his face close to Marcus's. Then I let the authorities handle you. Every bribed contact, every compromised channel, every illegal surveillance operation you ran, all of it documented, time-stamped, and ready to be delivered. I've kept records, Marcus. I always keep records. He released Marcus's wrist and stepped back. Marcus stayed on 1 knee for a moment, rubbing his wrist, staring at the terrace floor. Then he stood slowly, straightened his jacket, and walked past them toward the suite doors without another word. The elevator chimed softly in the hallway. The doors opened and closed, and then he was gone. Claire exhaled. She hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath for the last 2 minutes. Her hands were trembling, and she pressed them flat against her thighs to steady them. Arthur stood at the terrace railing, looking out over the city. The wind moved through his silver hair, and the lights of downtown Chicago reflected in his dark eyes like scattered embers. "Is it over?" Claire asked. Arthur turned to her. "The hard part is." She walked to the railing and stood beside him. 19 floors below, the city continued its endless rhythm. Taxis, pedestrians, traffic lights cycling from green to red to green. None of them knew what had just happened up here. None of them ever would. "You were never in danger," Arthur said quietly. "I need you to know that. I would never have brought you here if I thought Marcus could reach you." Claire looked at him. "I know." And she did. They drove back to Lake Geneva the next morning, under a sky so blue it looked painted. Claire sat in the passenger seat this time, her window cracked open, letting the warm Wisconsin air push through the car in lazy currents. The countryside rolled past. Cornfields, red barns, white farmhouses with porches that sagged in the middle from decades of use. Everything felt slower out here, like the land itself operated on a different clock than the cities they had been running through for the past week. Arthur drove. It was the first time Claire had seen him behind a wheel, and it changed something about him. He drove the way he did everything else, controlled, deliberate, one hand resting on the wheel and the other on the armrest between them. But there was a looseness in his shoulders that she hadn't noticed before. The tension that had lived in his body since Boston had begun to dissolve, mile by mile, as Chicago shrank behind them. They arrived at the estate just before noon. The lake was glass, perfectly still, reflecting the trees and the clouds so precisely that Claire couldn't tell where the water ended and the sky began. A pair of loons called from somewhere near the far shore, their voices carrying across the silence like music played in an empty room. Arthur unlocked the house and opened every window on the ground floor. Fresh air poured through the rooms, stirring the curtains and carrying the green smell of cut grass and warm pine. He made coffee, while Claire set up a workspace on the large oak dining table, arranging her tools in the familiar order that had become a kind of ritual over the past 7 days. The original painting, the 19th century landscape that had started everything, had travelled with them the entire journey, carefully stored in a padded case that Arthur's driver had transferred between vehicles at every stop. Claire lifted it from the case and placed it flat on the table, running her fingers along the edges she had spent 3 weeks restoring before any of this began. It felt like greeting an old friend after a long trip. Beside the painting, she laid out everything they had collected. The microledger from the canvas lining, the architectural sketch from Brooklyn, the decoded real estate coordinates from Philadelphia, and now the Hargrove trust deeds from the Chicago vault. A stack of heavy legal documents printed on watermarked paper, each one bearing notarized signatures and embossed seals from decades past. Arthur sat across from her, reviewing each deed with a pair of reading glasses and a fountain pen, making small annotations in the margins. Claire watched him work for a few minutes before turning to her own task. "The canvas needs to be resealed," she said. "Once I close the secondary lining, the original hiding space will be invisible again. But I want to do something different this time." Arthur looked up. "Different how?" "Your father hid a paper ledger inside a painting because he didn't trust digital systems. That was smart for the 1980s, but paper degrades. The ink on that ledger was already fading when I extracted it. Another 20 years and the heat-reactive layer would have been completely unreadable." She pulled a thin USB drive from her bag, the kind used for archival data storage, built to last decades without corruption. "I've been digitizing everything as we've gone, every coordinate, every deed number, every coded entry from the original ledger, encrypted with a key that only you and I know. If I seal this drive inside the canvas lining, along with the original paper, you'll have 2 independent records, one analog, one digital." Redundancy. Arthur studied her for a long moment. Then he removed his glasses and set them on the table. "You've been planning this since Philadelphia." I've been planning this since the plane. You handed me a problem that had a single point of failure, and that's the kind of thing that keeps me awake at night. Something moved across Arthur's face, a kind of quiet admiration that he didn't bother trying to hide. Do it. Claire worked through the afternoon. The resealing process was delicate, more delicate than the extraction had been, because now she was adding material to a canvas that was nearly 200 years old. She used conservation-grade adhesive, period-appropriate linen thread, and a micro-stitching technique she had developed during her graduate work at the Museum of Fine Arts. Every stitch had to be invisible. Every layer had to breathe the way the original canvas breathed, expanding and contracting with temperature and humidity without pulling apart. Arthur stayed at the table the entire time, working through the legal documents with the kind of focused attention Claire recognized from her own restoration work. He sorted the deeds by property type, residential, commercial, agricultural, and cross-referenced each one against the decoded ledger entries. By late afternoon, he had assembled a complete inventory of the Hargrove Trust holdings. 17 properties, he said, leaning back in his chair. 6 in the Northeast, 4 in the Midwest, 3 in California, 2 in France and 2 in Italy. Combined assessed value, conservatively, somewhere north of $400 million. Claire paused her stitching. 400 million. My father was many things. Modest was never one of them. She shook her head and returned to the canvas. The number was staggering, but what struck her more was what Arthur intended to do with it. He wasn't hoarding wealth or consolidating power, he was doing the opposite. Every document he had annotated, every legal notation he had made, pointed toward one goal: transferring the entire trust into a legitimate legal framework that could be audited, taxed, and managed transparently. He was bringing the money into the light, permanently. Once these deeds are filed with the proper authorities, Arthur said, as if reading her thoughts, the Hargrove Trust becomes a standard legal entity. No shadows, no hidden accounts, no leverage for anyone in the organization to use against me or anyone connected to me. He paused, and his eyes moved to Claire. That includes you. Claire's hands went still on the canvas. What do you mean? Your father's involvement with my family, the accounting work, the redirected records, the federal investigation, all of it was tied to the old financial structure, the structure I'm dismantling right now. Once the trust is legitimized, the trail that connects your father's name to any of this disappears, legally, officially, and permanently. Claire stared at him. The weight of what he was saying settled through her body like warm water, reaching places she hadn't realized were still cold. For 12 years, she had carried a vague, unnamed fear, the sense that her father's past might someday reach forward and pull her under. She had never known exactly what he had done or who he had done it for, but the fear had been there, humming beneath the surface of her carefully built life like a frequency only she could hear. And Arthur was erasing it. You didn't have to do that, she said. I know. You could have used it. My father's connection to your family, that's leverage. You could have held it over me indefinitely. Arthur folded his reading glasses and placed them in his breast pocket. I've spent my entire adult life watching people hold leverage over each other. It poisons everything it touches. I'm tired of poison, Claire. She looked down at the canvas on the table, the painting that had brought them together, the painting that held secrets inside its layers, the way people hold secrets inside theirs. She pressed the final stitch into place, sealed the lining with a thin bead of archival adhesive, and set down her tools. It's done, she said. Arthur reached across the table and rested his hand over hers. His palm was warm and steady, the same hand that had anchored hers on a turbulent plane 6 days ago. Claire didn't pull away. She turned her hand over beneath his, and their fingers laced together on the surface of the old oak table. Outside, the sun dropped below the tree line, and the lake turned to gold. The loons called again, 2 voices finding each other across the water, patient and clear. 3 days later, Claire stood on a balcony overlooking the Pacific Ocean and tried to remember what her life had felt like 10 days ago. It was harder than she expected. Boston felt like something she had read about in a book, familiar but distant, belonging to a version of herself that hadn't yet walked through locked doors with a man she barely knew and come out the other side, changed. The woman who had been scrubbing varnish off a canvas at midnight in her Seaport studio existed somewhere in her memory, but she felt like a photograph left in a drawer. Recognizable, a little faded, no longer quite current. The house behind her was extraordinary. A low-slung modern structure built into the cliffs south of Carmel, all glass and weathered cedar and native stone that looked like it had grown directly out of the hillside. Arthur had purchased it 8 years ago from a retired film composer who wanted to downsize, and he had kept it largely untouched, the kind of place designed to frame the landscape rather than compete with it. Every room faced the ocean. Every window was a painting that changed by the hour. Claire wrapped her hands around a mug of tea and watched the morning fog pull apart over the water. Below the cliffs, the surf broke against dark rocks in long, rolling patterns that repeated endlessly without ever being exactly the same. Pelicans glided just above the wavetops, riding invisible currents with a patience that made flying look effortless. She heard footsteps behind her and turned. Arthur walked onto the balcony carrying his own coffee, dressed in a white linen shirt and dark trousers, the most casual she had ever seen him. Without the tailored suits and the tension that had followed them from city to city, he looked different. Lighter. The deep lines around his eyes were still there, but they seemed to belong to a man who had earned them through living rather than surviving. "The committee called this morning," he said, leaning against the railing beside her. "It's official. The transition is complete." Claire looked at him. "All of it?" "All of it. Operations have been transferred to a 5-person council. Day-to-day authority, strategic decisions, personnel, everything runs through them now. I retain a consulting role and final veto power, but the practical reality is that I'm out." He said it the way someone describes putting down a heavy bag after carrying it for miles, with relief, but also with a strange tenderness for the weight itself. "How does it feel?" Claire asked. Arthur sipped his coffee and looked out at the ocean. A long moment passed before he answered. "Like waking up in a house with rooms I've never opened. I keep finding space I didn't know I had." Claire smiled. She understood that feeling. Over the past 3 days, as the urgency of the journey had faded and the adrenaline had drained from her system, she had started noticing things about herself that the chaos had buried. She was sleeping deeper than she had in years. Her appetite had returned, real appetite, the kind that made her actually enjoy food instead of treating it as fuel between work sessions. And her mind, which had spent a decade running at full speed without pause, had begun to slow down enough to wander. She had spent yesterday afternoon sketching in a notebook she found in the house's small library. Loose, unplanned drawings, the cypress trees along the cliff path, the shape of Arthur's hands resting on the kitchen counter, the curve of the coastline as seen from the guest bedroom window. It wasn't restoration work. It wasn't client work. It was the kind of drawing she used to do in college, before her father died and survival became her only creative brief. Arthur had watched her sketch without interrupting, sitting in an armchair across the room, reading a biography of a Renaissance architect. They had spent the entire afternoon like that, 2 people sharing a quiet space, each doing something they loved, neither one needing the other to perform or explain or fill the silence. It was the most intimate experience Claire had ever had with another person, and nobody had said a word. Now, standing on the balcony with the fog burning off and the ocean stretching out toward the horizon, Arthur set down his coffee and turned to face her fully. "I need to say something, and I want you to hear the whole thing before you respond." Claire set down her tea. "Okay." 10 days ago, I walked into your studio and took your choice away from you. I told myself it was necessary, that the ledger mattered, that the timeline was urgent, that I had no alternative. And all of that was true. But it was also true that I wanted to meet you, and I used the situation to make that happen on my terms. That was wrong. He paused. His dark eyes held hers without wavering. Everything I said at Lake Geneva was real. Every moment between us since then has been real. But none of it means anything if it started with you being forced into a car at midnight. So here's what I'm offering. Your studio in Boston is untouched. Your name is clean. The legal trail connecting your father to my family has been permanently dissolved. There is a first-class ticket to Logan Airport sitting on the kitchen counter with your name on it, and if you want to use it, I will drive you to the airport myself and wish you well. He took a breath. You are completely free to leave, Claire, and I need you to know that before I ask you to stay. The ocean crashed below them. A gust of salt wind moved through Claire's hair and pressed the fabric of her shirt against her shoulders. She looked at Arthur, at this man who had locked her doors and opened her world, who had cooked her pasta and outmaneuvered his enemies and held her hand on a turbulent plane with the steadiness of someone who had spent 60 years learning how to be exactly where he was needed. She thought about Boston, about her studio, her brushes, her quiet apartment above the waterfront. She thought about the life she had built there, small, careful, entirely her own. It was a good life, a safe life, a life she had earned with everything she had. And then she thought about the way Arthur looked at her when she talked about art. The way he listened, fully, completely, with his entire attention, as if what she was saying mattered more than anything else in the room. She thought about Lake Geneva, the candlelight on the water, his mother's books on the shelves. She thought about the way his hand felt beneath hers, warm, steady, certain. She thought about rooms she hadn't opened yet. The global art collection you mentioned, Claire said. The one tied to the Hargrove Trust. 17 properties across 3 continents. Somebody's going to need to catalogue, authenticate, and restore every piece in that collection. That's years of work. Arthur's mouth curved. It could be. I'd want full creative authority, my own team, a dedicated restoration studio at whatever property serves as the primary residence. I think that could be arranged. And I'm not relocating permanently until I've been back to Boston to close my lease and ship my equipment. Naturally. Claire stepped forward and slid her arms around him. He pulled her close, one hand resting on the back of her head, the other pressing flat against her spine, and they stood together on the balcony above the Pacific, with the morning light pouring over them like something new. For the record, Claire murmured against his chest, I'm staying because I want to. Because you gave me every reason to leave and I'm choosing this. I need you to know that. Arthur rested his chin on top of her head and closed his eyes. I know. Below them, the fog finished clearing and the ocean revealed itself fully, vast, bright, stretching toward a horizon that looked like the beginning of something rather than the end. The cypress trees along the cliff swayed in a wind that smelled like salt and pine and possibility. Somewhere in Boston, a studio sat waiting, its lights off, its canvases leaning quietly against the walls. It would keep. Good things always do. And on a balcony in Carmel by the sea, 2 people who had found each other through a hidden ledger and a 200-year-old painting stood together in the sunlight, watching the world open up in front of them like a story that was just getting started.